Training camp is officially here for the Denver Broncos, and here are 3 questions Sean Payton and the coaching staff must answer here in 2024. You're going to get all that and much more from the South Stands to the end zone on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there, predominantlyorange.com. Look, training camp is here this week. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of buzz building around towards Friday's open practice at the Broncos Park, powered by Common Spirit. A lot of things to talk about, but for the Broncos this season, the coaching staff must be ready to answer these 3 questions respectively, and we're going to dive deep into that. So here's what you're going to get on today's episode of the show. We'll dive deep into special teams. Is the special team side of the ball Denver's strongest unit going into the season? Is there pressure on Vance Joseph after what happened last year, and could that pressure be a little bit more internal based on some personnel moves? And is Sean Payton's offensive approach going to change this upcoming season? You'll get all that on today's episode of the show. Real quick, I want to say thank you to our friends over there at LinkedIn Jobs. They help you find the most qualified candidates you want to talk to faster and for free. So make sure you go check them out. LinkedIn.com/LockedOnNFL. That's LinkedIn.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Speaking of terms and conditions, Sayre, the Broncos offense, obviously orchestrated, constructed by Sean Payton, who we know has a vast experience in the National Football League. Last season, Denver's offense wasn't good enough. I think we can all acknowledge that. But there is a question, I think, to be had here on whether or not Sean's approach will change for Denver this upcoming season. The reason I throw that out there is because at the end of last year, Sean had a media session with us, and he told us, he could have been better in a lot of areas. They went out this offseason. They added Pete Carmichael as a senior offensive assistant. So part of me is wondering, could we maybe see Payton switch to a little bit more of a manage the game style of approach? And will he hand off play calling maybe to somebody else?
That's going to be interesting to find out. He doesn't necessarily strike me as the type of guy that really wants to give that up. He's a chess player out there, isn't he? I mean, Sean Payton has always been one of the best at manipulating what defenses do and understanding personnel and making sure that he puts his players in the right position at the right time. Now, I mean, I guess you never know, right? With all those familiar faces there, he has a lot of coaches that he can trust on the staff. So it's something that will be worth monitoring. I'm sure he'll get asked about it early on in training camp. Like, hey, what's the plan for this year? What do you plan on doing? To me, in terms of his approach this season, I find it interesting that we're going to see. Remember last year at this time, there was a lot of talk from Sean Payton about, hey, we got to play the greatest hits for Russell Wilson. If we want to get him back on page, we have to play his greatest hits. And what does that mean? That means doing what he does well and facilitating the offense toward what Russell Wilson does well. And we saw the friction between not necessarily just the, Sean Payton yelling at Russ on the sideline, but you could tell on the field, like early in the season, it was clear that Russ had the freedom to change plays at the line of scrimmage, do all these sorts of things, make adjustments. But over time, you could tell that it was frustrating Sean Payton that it wasn't his offense that was being executed. It was too much of the greatest hits. We were hearing too much bye, and not a lot of the B tracks, right? A lot of the stuff that, the diehard fans like to hear. And so I think that's kind of the problem is like, you can't just keep playing the same song over again. To me, the approach from Sean Payton, I feel like we're going to see the playbook opened up a little bit more. Whether or not he's calling the plays, I don't know. That remains to be seen.
Well, kind of playing into that in terms of opening the playbook up, is it going to be a run the ball to set up the pass approach here for the offense, or is it going to be a little bit more balanced? I felt like last year, and look, granted, early on in the regular season, because Denver at times, minus the Raiders game, they found themselves in a little bit of a deficit early on. And, outside of week 2, I mean, week 2, they had the advantage. They should have kept, they should have ran the ball in the second half versus trying to air it out and throw it the way that they did. But it seemed like the offense was very pass happy early on. And then the Broncos tried to switch it to, hey, let's just run the football. I know early on, was it week 4, Javonte Williams had the quad injury. So then Jaleel took over there at the running back position. And then Denver just had a string of just things happening. The defense giving up big plays, the debacle in week 3. And ultimately, when you're finding yourself trailing by 2 or more scores in one game, you have to abandon the run. And that was a little bit of the identity of the Broncos early on. And I think a lot of teams really just kind of settled in defensively by saying, hey, you know what? Let's make these guys throw the football. Like we're going to stop the run. We'll sell out to stop the run. We'll live with, us giving up a few first downs on a drive, but we're going to tighten up when it matters. And they're going to try to force Russ to do certain things. Like for Sean now, when you have two different quarterbacks that are ideally in the midst of this quarterback battle, I'm not saying that Zach Wilson isn't, but we're talking about the front runners here. What are Bo Nix's greatest hits? What are Jarrett Stidham's greatest hits? And how do you take the pressure off of them? How do you take pressure off the offense just being pass happy the way that it was early on? To me, that's a huge question here.
It is, because they couldn't run the ball effectively enough last year. There just wasn't that production from Javonte. Was the guy that was really being leaned on heavily in that way to say, all right, if we want to be establishing, remember last year, all the talk was the Broncos are going to be super physical. They're going to run the ball. They're going to run it well, and they're going to run it often. There was a lot of games where you and I were sitting here getting ready for a post game, and we just heard Sean Payton talk about he had to answer the question, like, why'd you guys abandon the run here? Why'd you guys abandon the run at this point? And it's like everything was dictated last year based on how bad the defense was early on in the season. And then as the season wore along, it was just it just didn't feel like there was any continuity. It didn't feel like there was much of a bread and butter for the offense. So what happens now if you are able to get the upper hand in terms of matchups, if your running backs are running the ball effectively? I think a lot is going to change this year, to be honest with you, Cody. It's going to feel different. It's going to look different. There's going to be a different level of execution and expectation of that execution. I just think last year was kind of all right, let's get as many people on the same page as we can and figure out what we need to replace. Whereas this season, it feels like it's going to be more along the lines of, all right, things need to be humming by week one with this offense. And it's not necessarily about playing Sean Payton's greatest hits. I think a lot of times people boil it down to that. It's like, well, it's all about Sean Payton. Then he's the dictator out there, and he's the guy who it's all about him, and it's all about drawing attention to him. That's not what it's about. It's about running an offense that he's trying to call, because he's a great chess player when it comes to creating those mismatches. So it's not about doing what he does best. It's about running the offense in totality, as opposed to having to facilitate an offense for a quarterback that doesn't necessarily run everything well.
Well, and I'll tell you this too. Sean doesn't think like that in terms of, hey, it's about what I can run. Like Sean knows very well as a coach. Like, obviously, you have to do things within the structure of your offense, your scheme, your foundational principles that you have in terms of run game operation, passing, things like that. But Sean's also very cognizant of the fact that what can our players do? What are we capable of doing? And what can we continue to throw at them to add onto their plate to where we can do more and more as the season wears on? That's really his approach there. And look, there's a lot of questions that are, hopefully going to be answered here this upcoming season. But obviously his approach on the offensive side of the ball this season is one of the biggest questions this coaching staff must be ready to answer here in 2024. But as we shift focus here on today's episode of the show, we'll focus on the Broncos defense. Vance Joseph under a lot of pressure here in 2024. That is a huge question that we have, considering the shadow of last season still looms largely in Dove Valley. We'll break all that down and much more here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos Country. Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. And look, in the summertime, sports aren't sportsing the way that you and I would like them to, but with the NFL season around the corner, right now is the perfect opportunity to get back in the game with FanDuel, as training camp is getting ready to kick off. NFL preseason is just in a few weeks, and FanDuel lets you get involved on all the action, including NFL futures. You can bet on who you think will win the MVP award this season, who you think will win the Super Bowl, or you can put together a parlay and try to figure out who's going to win all of the divisions this upcoming season. These are some of the things I do, and FanDuel Sportsbook is a platform that allows me to do just that. And look, they're making it fun for fans to get involved this summer. FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball.
Could 2024 be the final year for Vance Joseph as Denver Broncos defensive coordinator? He's under a lot of pressure this year, not just because of who is behind him on the coaching staff right now, but because of what lies ahead. Is he going to be a head coach again? Could he be a defensive coordinator outside of Denver? Who would want Vance Joseph in that role besides the Denver Broncos currently? There's a lot going on for Vance Joseph and the defensive side of the ball here in 2024, and we're going to break that down on today's episode of Locked On Broncos. And hey, thank you so much for making us part of your day, however you choose to do so. If you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, thank you. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you. And subscribe wherever you listen or watch, or do both, and really get this out in front of Broncos country, because you know what? Training camp, we're there, and you're going to want the latest in everything Denver Broncos that is going on, whether it's player movement, whether it's training camp updates, whatever it might be. Follow along. And if you haven't already, check out Locked On Sports today on YouTube, streaming for free 24/7, and get that localized coverage that you want from experts that cover the teams that you love every single day right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And you can watch that streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Let's talk about Vance Joseph, because Cody, he's in a weird spot right now, because I know that there's potential and talk that, you know, maybe he still wants to be a head coach again. I'm sure he would after the debacle that was his tenure with the Denver Broncos. Not really all his fault either. I mean, he got Case Keenum as his option, you know, to start a quarterback. And I think he had a year of Paxton Lynch even there. So it wasn't really a fair opportunity, because he was an ascending coach. Gary Kubiak vouched for him. I think Gary was a big reason why the Broncos hired Vance instead of Kyle Shanahan back in 2017. Because they wanted him so badly as the defensive coordinator post Wade Phillips. So there's a history here between Vance and the Broncos that doesn't necessarily involve Sean Payton, but I think his history as a head coach looms large over this season, because what happened last year could prevent him from getting a head coach job in the future, as well as maybe even another defensive coordinator job if things go poorly again in 2024.
Yeah, no, those are great points that you make there. And for Vance, it's like, where did things go wrong for the Broncos last year? And I think we both acknowledge this on the show. And I don't know how much of Broncos country knows this information. I know a lot of the everydayers that tune in probably know this because we've highlighted this. But the Broncos, when they did hire Vance Joseph, the idea was for Sean, the vision that Sean pitched to Vance, and Vance was on board with it when he took the job, was, hey, this defense for the past 2 years prior to last season, under Vic, under Ejiro Evero, this is what they did well. This is where there's a level of comfort. You have a lot of the same personnel returning, and the defense was pretty good in that regard. So why tinker with that? Why mess with that? Why try to ruin that? I mean, really, Sean Payton wanted to keep Evero on staff. Evero did not like how the Broncos did Hackett, and so he went elsewhere, you know, or else I think Evero would have still been the DC in Denver, to be honest with you. But the thing is Vance was on board with running that same defensive scheme. And look, Vance, it was a risky decision for him, because ultimately it has impacted, I think, the widespread perception of him a little bit, because for the first 5-6 weeks, they were running that old defense. And then at one point, the Broncos are sitting at 1-5. They're like, you know what? Like, why are we continuing to do this? Let's go back. Like, Vance, start installing your stuff, start, you know, calling your terminology, like bridging the gap a little bit. Vance started to run his defense a lot more after the 1-5 start. And then ironically enough, the Broncos, they went on that little 5-game win streak. The defense, they were forcing turnovers. They were playing much better. They were in drastically different position than they were in the first 5 weeks of the season. And that right there, I don't want to say it's like, okay, well, hey, 1 + 1 = 2 in this situation. But that was a big part of why the Broncos started to get continuity a little bit. They started to get more confidence running Vance's scheme. Now, they had moments last year, and I think down the end stretch when the Broncos were still in the playoff hunt, they had games against the Houston Texans where they gave up almost 200 yards to Nico Collins in that one game there. And then in the Detroit Lions game, they gave up a drastic amount of points. They couldn't stop the run, and they got gashed there by two teams that were in the playoffs, right? And so that was a test and a measure of, okay, where's this Broncos team at? Now, I think the early part of last season, Sayre, still looms largely over the perception of Vance and the Broncos defense. It's much different, though, because the Broncos, they're running a scheme now that they're super comfortable with. Again, I mean, this has been a constant change in this organization for the last handful of years, but you also have new personnel that's kind of learning it as well, that it's getting involved with. So now it's not like how it has been. It has a chance to be better this year, even if the belief internally, I mean, outside, not internally, externally, is not like that from Broncos country.
Right. And it deals with that perception that you talked about. The perception is that I think a lot of fans don't think much of Vance Joseph, to be honest with you. And I think obviously when you listen to the guy talk, he seems like a great dude, loves his family. I saw him on that, on Hard Knocks. You can't help but like the guy. I mean, he's just
Super
seems
nice
like
guy.
and you definitely get the vibes of what like Gary Kubiak and all those people, John Elway, all those guys wanted from him. Like, what was the thing that's now kind of an infamous thing about him is that he's a leader of men, right? I think that's kind of become almost a negative connotation when you talk about a potential head coach, because what does that mean? Well, it kind of sounds like you're saying he doesn't necessarily have an expertise. It's just that he's a great leader. And I think Vance is that way. I mean, I think we saw when he started taking the reins of what the defense was going to look like, we saw a drastic turnaround from that unit. And you've heard players this offseason talking about the fact that now the defensive linemen in particular are saying we're no longer having to like think as much. We are attacking. We're in attack mode. That's what Vance has always done well to me. Remember when Bradley Chubb and Von Miller, they combined for what, almost
26
sacks?
and a half. Yeah.
26 and a half. So that was at the peak. And I know the Broncos weren't good in 2018. I know that they weren't good, but there was good elements of what we saw. We saw some solid player development from Vance, and not every area, because we're talking about some of the worst Broncos teams ever. And that's not all his fault. He got handed that situation. And so I'm not trying to make excuses for Vance. I'm not trying to say that, well, this doesn't have to be better, because so much has to be better. We need to see the proof in the pudding. Like, his defense gave up 70 points last year. You and I keep it pretty, I would say, diplomatic on this show in terms of like, we're not coming on after a game and calling for a guy's job. I think even you and I, after that game, were saying, look, you may have to make a change at the defensive coordinator spot. Like, that was as bad as I've ever seen in the NFL in 34, almost 35 years of life. There's no way that this defense isn't going to be turned up a notch this year after what everyone's saying about them. The personnel, nobody believes in this team. I think defensively, we're going to see a renewed identity for not only Vance, but for his players as well.
Well, and I can tell you this, having talked to several Broncos players, defensive players here this offseason, that is, they're taking notes. They're keeping, cliff notes on what people are saying, and they're bookmarking things. So be prepared. Like, if the Broncos defense comes out, guarantee you're going to see some quote tweets coming out from, some freezing cold takes exposed there in terms of Broncos players calling some people out there. They understand what's at stake, though. But I also think, too, when you look at what the organization has done in terms of moves here, and we'll make this quick, then bringing in, obviously, Jim Leonard as the passing game coordinator, defensive backs coach this year, a double title. That right there can't be ignored. Obviously, what he did at the college level as a defensive coordinator, one of the top defenses in the nation when he was coaching them, and was strongly in consideration for that head coaching job there, where he should have got it. But I think the politics kind of got in the way of that. And so that kind of formulated and led to where it's at. But he's considered a name right now in NFL coaching circles as a potential future defense coordinator or head coach to watch for here. And obviously his experience as a former player, you're seeing that trend, like D'Amico Ryans just being one of those guys as well. Like, you're seeing some former players who've turned into head coaches, D'Amico being the more recent one, that people are like, hey, we're going to give this a try here. Jim could be in that conversation here. So I think that's why we amplify. There might be a little bit more pressure on Vance, because if the defense is struggling, he may be the fall guy in that situation. And you may see Jim Leonard step into the mix here at some point this season or next year for the Broncos. And that's obviously a big question here that we have here for this coaching staff going into 2024. But you know what? There's three elements to the game of football. Special teams is important. And it was so crucial for the Broncos last season. What must Ben Kotvika and Mike Westhoff be ready to answer in 2024? You're going to get all that on today's episode of Locked On Broncos. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at LinkedIn Jobs. And when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role or opportunity. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. And on LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses, they get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even quicker and easier. And they know that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or the resources to hire. So check out LinkedIn today. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Ben Kotwica, Mike Westhoff, they came into the Denver Broncos last offseason, and they changed the way that unit played football, and they emerged as one of the best units in all of the NFL last season in terms of their kick coverage, their punt coverage, their return yardage, creating an all-pro and also a Pro Bowl returner in Marvin Mims during his rookie season. Special teams for the Broncos last year was special, but what questions loom large about that unit going into 2024? We're going to answer that, but real quick, wanted to say thank you once again to everyone in Broncos Country for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. You can get Locked On Broncos for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So subscribe or follow if you haven't done so already, so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team. Training camp is here this week, folks. You know how big that is for this show, for all you avid listeners out there. We're excited to bring it for you every single day, every step of the way here. Sayre, let's obviously go into special teams here in terms of what, questions loom around this unit. I think there are a couple here. And look, I don't know if we're going to get extensive clarity on it, but I think right now the Broncos have some comfort knowing that they have a kicker who's locked in for a couple of years here. I remember at first he departed in free agency, went to the Jaguars, and then decided to come back to Denver. Will Lutz signed a contract extension, and obviously last year didn't get off to the best start here for the Broncos in that week 1 game. You talk about a point swing, a game you needed to win, a missed field goal, a missed extra point. That obviously influenced the outcome of that game in week 1 here. But now he kind of built some consistency toward the season, hit a couple of big game winners, Chicago being one of them, the Buffalo Bills game being another one, even though it was a little bit of a, hey, here's a mulligan. But Will Lutz is somebody I think that the Broncos need to kind of build a little bit more up this upcoming season. And you just hope can he stay consistent? Because I think we always worry when somebody gets paid, right? There's the psychology. Hey, I've got money. I'm secure. I have a job. That right there, I hope you don't fall into that complacent thinking for a kicker because, hey, you need to perform big because that's what you got paid for. You got paid to make game-winning field goals. You got paid to make extra points. To me, I'm curious to see if Will Lutz, if that doesn't change his approach a little bit.
Especially because when a kicker gets the yips, I mean, it's almost like it's over. I mean, that was kind of what we saw last season from a number of kickers around the league. And guys lose jobs over it. Good kickers lose jobs over it. I mean, think about the Carlson brothers. The guy who's with the Raiders now was drafted by the Minnesota Vikings. I remember seeing that guy at the Senior Bowl booming 60-yarders like it was nothing. And then all of a sudden you miss a couple kicks in your rookie preseason and you get cut by the team. And his brother in Green Bay was perfect up until they came to Denver last year. Remember, that's another 1-point game. The Packers lose that game. You miss a field goal at a point during that game. And all of a sudden, well, he goes on this downward spiral, and it can happen for so many kickers. Like it just spirals out of control. You miss one, all of a sudden you're missing 8 out of your next 10 or 12, and so you can't have that kind of stuff with the kicking position. Consistency, it feels like it's really hard to come by, but when you have a good kicker, it's almost like you don't even notice they're there. And that's the kicker you want, is the guy that nobody's talking about unless they're making game-winning kicks. You don't want people talking about your kicker. You don't want them talking about your long snapper or punter or things like that. You want those guys to be doing so well at their jobs that people don't really talk about them, except for the fact that, man, that was a nice kick, So with Will Lutz, it's got to be getting off to a hotter start. The Broncos don't have competition there. There's only one position group amongst the specialists, the kicker, punter, and long snapper. Only Riley Dixon has competition, not Will Lutz, not Mitchell Fraboni. None of those guys have competition, but Riley Dixon at punter. So when you don't have that competition, it adds another layer of stress among the fan base, because if Will Lutz doesn't perform well, the Broncos are going to be back to square one, which is a scary place to be in today's NFL.
I remember last year in training camp, everyone was watching the kicking competition. Everyone was keeping notes. Okay, this guy was, 5 for 5, or this guy was 2 for 2 from 30 plus. This guy was, 2 for 3 from 40 plus yards. Who was the most consistent? I remember the carousel that was a little bit ongoing there during, obviously, training camp and the preseason. No, Will Lutz was not even on the Broncos roster then. I mean, that's where Denver was at. They had 2 or 3 kickers come in during camp, and then none of those guys were even on the roster come week 1. So there is that. Hopefully, Will can just be a complete, consistent factor here for Denver on special teams this upcoming season. Trenton Gill coming in from the Chicago Bears to compete with Riley Dixon for the punter job can also have those kickoff opportunities. There's things that I think are going on here on special teams that I don't think our questions about this unit are as big as they were in years past. Like in years past, like I remember we were doing some post-game shows like, the Broncos win this game if it weren't for special teams in terms of them giving up a big kick return or a punt return or a penalty, a roughing the kicker, a roughing the punter, whatever it may be. Denver was plagued by special teams mishaps over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, except for last season. Build on that, I think, is super important here for Mike Westhoff, Ben Kotwick, but maybe even another thing here too as well is I think really the biggest question that we have here on special teams. Who is the returner going to be? Now, obviously, Marvin Mims made the Pro Bowl last year, was an all-pro there in terms of what he was able to do as a return guy. You know how special he is in terms of his ability to field the ball. That's one thing I like about Marvin is Marvin's got great focus, especially on punt. When he's seeing guys, 2 gunners run full speed at him, he trusts in his guys, his jammers, but he also trusts in his ability to field the football. And he didn't create a lot of issues for you in that department. He had some pretty big returns to help put the offense in decent field position. My question here is, will Marvin still be the kick returner and the punt returner here this upcoming season? Because the NFL's kick return rules have changed a little bit. Now you're going to probably have 1 guy up, 2 guys back to return in terms of the end zone on the kick return side of things. Punt return wise, is Marvin going to be the guy that's going to handle that because of the fact that Sean Payton has acknowledged that they have emphasis to give him a bigger role on the offensive side of the ball this year? Where is he more valuable in your opinion? This factors into the question on special teams.
Well, you're going to get fewer opportunities as a punt returner. And so I kind of feel like with the increased role offensively, maybe you keep him as the punt returner because, yeah, it's still dangerous back there and you're still taking some hard hits potentially. But at the same time, you may only return 16, 20 or so punts. I mean, I don't know. I guess I don't know what the league average is for a guy every season, but you may get 1 or 2 opportunities a week, if that. And so to me, maybe keeping him on punt return and increasing the role offensively makes sense because we know these kickoff returners, I mean, they could get upwards of 50 or more touches in that way. And so it's really up to Sean Payton and the staff to say, all right, do we feel like he's and I think you could weaponize him back there in the kickoff return game as well. I don't think there's an instance that we say like for the entire season, he's not returning kicks at all. I think there could be games where maybe the Broncos need a spark and you throw Marvin Mims back there in the kickoff return game. I don't necessarily see him as that full-time guy though. And he could be, but at the same time, I don't know. That's a tough one to say because he's so good at it. You want him back there. But at this, you also have guys like Jalen Virgil that you're coming back from injury, and he could be just as good, if not even better, as a kickoff returner. And he's got that bigger body to maybe absorb some more of those hits. So that's where Cody, I don't know, because he's so good at it. Marvin Mims is, and you want him to be in positions where he can make plays because he's an asset in that way, and that can flip field position in an instant. So I just don't know whether or not that's going to be the smartest move in terms of, do you give him those extra touches and have him taking those additional hits?
The question too here, I mean, really kind of putting into perspective, your hope is that maybe you have 1 or 2 returns in a game, because if you're constantly going back and let's say one game you have to field 4 or 5 returns, it means your defense is getting cooked. You don't want that. So ideally, to open a game or to open up the second half, you want to have your return option there is 1 play. I mean, to be honest with you, I think the sample size, it's much safer in terms of contact, in terms of volume, and obviously like the amount of contact that you can absorb there. You're not having guys run from the 35, 40-yard line just full speed anymore, just blasting your guys. Like it's all engaged. It's controlled chaos now. I might be a little bit more okay with that, but I think also the fact that you're going to have 2 guys in the back that are returning, And if it's kicked to the right, then you're going to have the left guy come up, and I don't know what's happening on the screen, but you're going to have the left guy come up and block for the guy on the right side, or vice versa. Whoever the ball is kicked to, like, you're going to have options here. So for me, I think Marvin is a dangerous guy there. I think we have to see early on, though, like, what does it look like? I think we need to see some sample size here in the preseason. Who's going to return in the new setup? What does it look like? And is there something that the Broncos can build off of it? That's the question that I have here. But look, Broncos country, these are the three questions that the Denver Broncos coaching staff, in our opinion, must be ready to answer here in the 2024 NFL season. A lot at stake as training camp begins this week. It is officially here, Broncos country. Football is right here on the horizon. We're so excited. We'll have you covered every single day, every step of the way here, following every training camp practice that happens. We'll have you covered with all the breaking news. So make sure you're subscribed or following Locked On Broncos wherever you get your podcasts, or available on YouTube to stay up to date all throughout this week. For all you everydayers, here's what you can expect on tomorrow's episode of the show. Will the Broncos youth that they have this upcoming season, will that hurt them, or will that help them? We'll share our thoughts on that subject matter and more. And for your second listen of the day, make sure you check out the Locked On NFL podcast for all the latest around the NFL as training camp kicks off. We'll see you then.